Have you ever stopped to think that ancient Greece, so celebrated as the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, was also a place where half the population simply had no voice? It's curious. We talk about freedom, but for women of that time, freedom meant waking up early, lighting the hearth fire, and repeating the same routine until night. A cruel paradox. On one side, Socrates arguing about justice. On the other, women silenced within the home without even the right to choose their own destiny. And the most intriguing thing is that even hidden behind the walls of the Gymnasium, they shaped an entire civilization. They were mothers, guardians of traditions, spinners of stories, and even protagonists of myths that still inspire thought today. It's as if, hidden within their silence, lay one of Greece's greatest forces, a force that doesn't appear in philosophy books, but which sustained the polis day after day. Now I want you to tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Answer here in the comments, because I want to feel the energy of each place that is connecting with this story. In ancient Greece, the birth of a girl already brought with it limited expectations. A father looked at the crib and instead of seeing infinite possibilities, saw responsibilities to protect, control, and direct the child's every step. It was as if her destiny were a pre-written book with no room for new scribbles. Unlike boys who were immediately given war toys, balls, or small training weapons, girls were taught to remain within the confines of the home, invisible to the eyes of the polis. Imagine for a moment living in a world where every decision you make depends on someone's permission. Want to go out? You have to ask. Want to learn? It's not always allowed. This was the feminine routine. The concept of freedom, so dear to us today, back then was nothing more than a luxury reserved for free men. It's curious to think that even the simple act of walking down the street, which for us is so banal, represented a huge barrier for an Athenian woman. Throughout the day, life followed a predictable rhythm. The sun rose, men went out to the public square or to war, while women remained at home, busying themselves with repetitive tasks. It was like living within a closed circle with no beginning or end. If today we complain about the Monday to Friday grind of work, imagine living in a routine where there's no prospect of change, an eternal stay at home without choice. This psychological burden was invisible, but it shaped entire generations. Some say that the patriarchal structure of ancient Greece was the foundation of Western thought, and indeed, it had a significant influence. But consider, what would it be like if these women had had a voice? Would the philosophers we so admire, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, have been challenged by equally brilliant but female minds? This provocation opens the door to reflecting on how many talents were silenced simply because they were born female. A practical example can be drawn from our own lives. How many times have we shelved ideas, hidden dreams, simply because we think they're not for us? The difference is that today we have the chance to break free from it. Reading a book written by women who defied their time, like Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, is almost like giving a voice to the Athenian women who never had a voice. It's bringing retroactive justice in the form of knowledge. And even though they had no choice at the time, there was a thread of continuity that even without a public voice, women's lives were essential to keeping the polis functioning. Perhaps precisely because they were on the margins, they carried a silent force, a presence that, though hidden, structured everything. And this presence, as we will see later, was not restricted to the home, but was also reflected in the concept of the oikos and the central role they played within it. The oikos was much more than four walls and a roof. It was the beating heart of Greek life, the place where food was prepared, the loom never rested, and traditions were passed down from generation to generation. Within this setting, women were not merely supporting characters, they were the guardians of everything that kept the home alive. Imagine the routine: waking before the sun, smelling the bread baking, hearing the sound of the loom working, coordinating servants and children. Every detail of this setting bore her mark. It's curious to note that while men were seen as responsible for the polis, the public space, women carried the burden of the private. If the oikos were a gear, it would be the central axis, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. It's like today when we say that someone holds the fort at home. Anyone who has seen a family without organization knows the chaos this can create. And back then, without technology, supermarkets, or appliances, the responsibility was even greater. Women's work in the oikos wasn't limited to manual tasks. It was also a matter of administration. They had to calculate grain stocks, distribute tasks among servants, and plan reserves for times of scarcity. In a sense, she was a manager, a sort of CEO of the household, even if no one recognized her as such. Today, we could compare it to running a small business, managing cash flow, inventory, and staff, only without Excel spreadsheets. But there was also a symbolic aspect. The oikos was the space of continuity, where the sacred family fire was kept burning. Literally, in many homes, the woman was responsible for keeping the hearth flame alive, as she represented divine protection. This simple gesture of tending the fire carried immense spiritual depth. It's like lighting a candle today during a moment of prayer, or preparing that special coffee that reminds you of your grandmother's house. Small rituals that give meaning to everyday life. And it's interesting to note that although they couldn't vote, speak, or participate in assemblies, women wielded a form of silent power within them, a power that wasn't shouted in the squares but transmitted in every meal served, in every thread woven, in every child raised. If the polis depended on public order, the oikos depended on this discreet but indispensable force. After all, what good would a strong city be if homes were dysfunctional? This intimate relationship between the private and public spheres shows that women's roles went beyond what met the eye. Women confined to the domestic sphere nonetheless shaped society from there. And this weight, this responsibility, is what paves the way for us to better understand how arranged marriages emerged and the role they played in maintaining this system. In ancient Greece, marriage was not seen as an act of romantic love, but rather as a strategic alliance. Parents and families met to discuss dowries, inheritances, and social conventions. The bride, often still a teenager, barely knew her future husband. Imagine the feeling, being about to completely change your life without it was like being a piece on a chessboard, moved by hands that weren't yours. For parents, marrying off their daughter meant ensuring the family's continuity and protecting their assets. Choosing a husband took into account status, wealth, and political connections. Love, that was considered secondary, almost irrelevant. It's curious to note how this contrasts with today, where love is almost always the central decision. Back then, the logic was different. Stability first, feelings later if they came at all. The wedding ritual itself also carried symbolic weight. The ceremony wasn't performed for the bride, but for her families. The dowry served as a guarantee, almost like a financial contract. We can think of a modern analogy. It would be like a merger between companies, where each side seeks mutual advantage. Only, in this case, the company was the daughter herself, and there was no negotiation possible for her. The bride's life changed overnight. A practical example, she stopped answering to her father and became her husband's guardian. This transfer of authority was official, recognized by the polis. Today, when we talk about female independence, about choosing who to share one's life with, it seems absurd to imagine that for centuries, this freedom simply didn't exist. It's as if someone else chose for you where to work, who to live with, and even how you should behave. And even if there was silent resistance, the rules were too clear to allow for exceptions. The stories that have survived, including some recorded in plays, show women questioning this fate, but always within very narrow limits. It's as if the flame of autonomy existed, but was stifled, waiting centuries to truly ignite. This dynamic of arranged marriages reveals not only female subjugation, but also social concerns about inheritance and legitimacy. And this concern connects directly to the next point, the central role of women in bearing legitimate children to ensure family continuity and asset security. In ancient Greece, the primary function attributed to women was clear: to ensure offspring. Society viewed the female body almost as a fertile field destined to perpetuate the husband's name and inheritance. From an early age, girls grew up hearing that their greatest mission would be to bear children, preferably sons. It's curious to consider how, at the very birth of so many philosophical ideas, the view of the female role was so narrow and reductionist. Having children was not just a desire, but a social duty. Without descendants, a family risked losing assets, property, and even political prestige. Imagine the psychological pressure. Each pregnancy was seen as a test of worth, and each birth brought with it the expectation of an heir. Unlike today, when motherhood can be a choice, back then it was almost like a contractual obligation implicit in marriage. Everyday life reinforced this mentality. A childless woman was viewed with suspicion, almost as if she carried a personal flaw. A woman who managed to produce heirs was respected, not for her individuality, but for what she offered her husband and family. It's akin to evaluating someone solely by their position or salary, ignoring the person's essence. And unfortunately, this logic has persisted for centuries. It's also important to consider the conditions of this maternity ward. Without the medical resources we have today, childbirth was risky and painful. Many women didn't survive the process, and yet society still forced them to repeat this cycle, pregnancy after pregnancy. Today, when we walk into a pharmacy and see prescription drugs, or when we get a routine ultrasound, we forget how much of a colossal advance this represents for those lives. And there was also an associated spiritual symbolism. Fertility was seen as a divine blessing, and specific cults, such as those of Demeter, were directly linked to the idea of motherhood and harvest. A woman's life was always compared to the cycle of the earth: birth, germination, and fruition. A beautiful metaphor, but in practice it reinforced the imprisonment of a single destiny. Feminine value was reduced to the biological, to the womb, and it was precisely in this context of demands and expectations that the wife's role became established. After all, it wasn't enough to simply bear children, but to ensure that they were the husband's legitimate heirs, preserving the family name and inheritance. And this is where we come to a new, even more specific point: the wife's central role in ensuring legitimacy for her descendant. In ancient Greece, marriage had an almost mathematical function: to ensure that the husband's assets would be inherited by legitimate children. The wife, in this context, was seen not only as a companion, but also as the guardian of the purity of the lineage. Female fidelity was therefore not only a moral issue, but also an economic and social pillar. After all, an illegitimate child could jeopardize the entire inheritance structure. This logic created constant surveillance over women's lives. They were kept in the domestic space, away from the gaze and contact of other men, as a form of guarantee. Today it may seem exaggerated, but consider this:
The home functioned almost like a fortress, and the gynoecium, a space reserved for women, was a symbol of this protection. The freedom to come and go, so natural to us, was seen as a threat to the legitimacy of heirs. Interestingly, the pressure didn't fall on men. If a husband had affairs outside of marriage, this didn't jeopardize his inheritance. For a woman, however, one slip up could jeopardize the entire family. This Galilean inequality shows us how much the social structure was designed to reinforce male control. We can compare it to current situations. How often are women's conduct still held more accountable than men? The birth of a legitimate child brought relief and strengthened the wife's position within the household. It was as if, with each child, she renewed her social contract with her husband in the polis. But it wasn't just about having children. It was about proving, time and again, her loyalty and her indispensable role in the family machine. Consider the weight of carrying this duty in every gesture, every look, every rumor that might circulate. This role of the wife became even more evident in situations of inheritance disputes.
Imagine a wealthy family with land and slaves. Doubts about a child's legitimacy could lead to legal battles, family wars, and even loss of political status. Therefore, the wife was watched as if she were the key to the safe, a cruel metaphor, but one that illustrates the mentality of the time. And this constant vigilance connected to the daily life of the home, where women played an active role in organizing the house and supervising tasks. After all, if she was confined to this space, it was also from there that her authority, albeit limited, emerged. And this is precisely where we arrive: the woman's role in managing the home and coordinating domestic chores. Within Greek homes, women played the role of administrator. Although they had no voice in the polis, within the oikos, their word was law. It was she who organized the rhythm of tasks. From dawn, when the slaves were already lighting the fire, until nightfall, when the last grains were counted for the next day. The home was like a small universe, and the woman was the figure who kept this world functioning in balance. What few realize is that this role required complex skills. It required a sense of planning, task division, supply management, and even dealing with everyday problems, such as illness among servants or food shortages. If we were to move forward, we'd say she was a team and resource manager, without spreadsheets, apps, or consulting services, just experience, memory, and practical sense. Supervising servants and slaves also involved dealing with different personalities. Imagine coordinating people who often didn't want to be there, who came from diverse backgrounds, each with their own pain and resistance. It was necessary to command respect, but also to create a certain harmony for tasks to flow. Anyone who has managed a team knows how challenging this can be. And back then, without labor rights or open dialogue, the pressure was even greater. Despite all this responsibility, recognition was minimal. Women's work within the home was seen as natural, almost invisible. There were no laurels or celebrations, only the expectation that everything would be in order. It's similar to what still happens today. Often those who keep the household running smoothly don't receive the recognition they deserve, because domestic work continues to be undervalued in our society. But however restricted, this role carried a quiet power. It was the woman who decided how each resource would be used, what would be cooked, when the fabrics would be ready, who would perform a certain task. Small choices that, taken together, shaped the life of the entire family. It's curious to think how, even confined to the private sphere, she wielded a real authority, albeit one not officially recognized. And it was precisely in this environment of yarn, looms, and repetitive tasks that one of the most symbolic activities of the female universe emerged:
textile production. Spinning, weaving, and transforming wool into clothing wasn't just manual labor, it was tradition, identity, and even a way of educating younger generations. In the silence of Greek homes, the most constant sound was not that of conversations, but that of the loom. Spinning and weaving were not just practical tasks, but true daily rituals that defined feminine identity. The wool passed between the fingers, the movement repeated, and from there emerged cloaks, tunics, and clothing that warmed and protected the entire family. It was as if each thread carried not only the woman's skill but also her patience and time. This activity held immense value. Homemade fabric was used not only to clothe the family, but also as a gift in exchange for favors, wedding gifts, or religious ceremonies. Imagine the pride of seeing something handmade worn at an important celebration, or even as an offering to a goddess. Today, we can compare it to the value of a handmade gift. It's not just the object itself, but the significance of the effort behind it. Furthermore, the act of weaving was laden with symbolism. Greek myths reinforce this. The Moirai, for example, were deities who spun the fate of men. Each thread on the loom represented life, continuity, the never-ending cycle. Thus, while women worked daily, there was also a spiritual dimension. To weave was to participate in some way in the very order of the cosmos. It was common for girls to learn how to handle needle and thread from an early age, observing their mothers and grandmothers. The learning wasn't just technical, but also moral. Each repeated gesture taught patience, discipline, and dedication. If we think about it today, it's like when a child learns to cook from their grandmother or assemble furniture from their father. It's not just about the practice, but also about the cultural heritage transmitted through this act. The loom, therefore, was more than an object. It was the center of the home, a place of whispered conversations, of exchange of experiences between generations, of reflective silence. Anyone who has spent hours doing manual work knows how deeply the mind wanders as the hands repeat the movements. In ancient Greece, this repetition helped shape not only clothing, but also a woman's identity. And yet, while women's hands shaped threads and fabrics, there was another realm of knowledge from which they were almost always excluded: formal education. And it is at this point that we understand how knowledge, writing, and reading became almost exclusive privileges of men. In ancient Greece, the birth of a boy was a cause for celebration, not only for the continuation of the lineage, but also because he would have access to knowledge. School, debates in the agora, the teachings of renowned masters, all of this was reserved for him. A girl, however intelligent, would rarely see a wax tablet to write on, or hear philosophy lessons. It was as if knowledge were a closed door locked to them. This scenario created a stark contrast within the homes. While the boys left early to learn to recite Homer or study music and rhetoric, the girls stayed home learning practical tasks: cooking, sewing, caring for their future husbands and children. Think about it. While some learned to argue about justice and politics, others were limited to baking bread or spinning wool. It was as if they lived in parallel worlds, albeit under the same roof. Of course, there were exceptions, but they were extremely rare. Some women from wealthier families, or foreigners of privileged status, managed to learn to read and write, but these were discordant notes in an otherwise uniform melody. The norm was clear: written knowledge did not belong to them. Imagine the weight of that. How many brilliant ideas, how many transformative thoughts may have been lost, simply because they were never recorded. Compared to today, we realize how almost unthinkable this scenario is. We have public schools, readily available books, and internet access on cell phones. A girl from any neighborhood can access information that in ancient times not even the greatest philosophers had access to. It's as if the world has turned upside down, and thank goodness it has. However, even with so much progress, we still carry remnants of this historical inequality, and thinking about this makes us appreciate even more the privilege we have of study. Anyone who has read a good biography, or a classic like Plato's The Republic, may not even realize that centuries ago, women couldn't even browse such a work. It's almost like inheriting a library that was previously inaccessible. Today, the least we can do is use this access to expand our horizons and not waste the path so many were unable to follow. And curiously, even without access to school, women found a space for action in another field, religion. There, amidst cults, processions, and rituals, they performed a role that gave them a visibility rare in the male world. In ancient Greece, if there was one place where women could emerge from the shadows of the home and gain some visibility, it was the religious. While their voices were denied in politics and education, in temples and festivals, they assumed prominent roles, participating in processions, tending offerings, overseeing rituals. All of this gave them a relevance they didn't find in other settings. It was like a breath of fresh air after so much confinement. The great festivals, such as the Thesmophoria in honor of Demeter, were led almost exclusively by women. Imagine hundreds of them gathered together, exchanging experiences, sharing songs and secret rites. For those who lived imprisoned in the Dionysium, these days were moments of liberation and even female community. It was as if the sacred space became a refuge, where they could be more than wives and mothers. This religious role also carried immense responsibility. A priestess, for example, could wield greater social influence than many women from wealthy families. After all, she was the one who maintained the bridge between gods and men, and in the Greek mindset, displeasing the gods meant risking the very survival of the polis. In other words, for a few moments, female spiritual power overcame male political power. If we look closely, there's an interesting parallel with our reality. How often, even in modern societies, is religious space still the first place where women gain some legitimacy? Whether in community groups, volunteer work, or celebrations, the sacred opens up opportunities that the official world is still reluctant to offer. History seems to repeat the same pattern, only in new guises. But of course, this recognition had its limit. Their freedom wasn't complete, and their religious importance didn't translate into a political voice. Still, it was there, in the temple and in the rituals, that they experienced a taste of autonomy. A rare moment when, instead of just being seen, they were also heard and followed. For many, it was perhaps the only way to leave a mark on the community's memory. And when we think about this protagonism, we soon realize that some of these roles, such as that of priestess, achieved even greater prominence because in certain cults and temples, female leadership was not only tolerated, but essential among women's religious roles. That of priestess held a place of rare prestige.
When a woman took on this role in temples dedicated to deities like Athena or Demeter, her presence gained an importance that transcended the confines of the home. Her voice guided rituals, ordered offerings, and led celebration. It was as if for a few moments the entire community bowed before her spiritual authority. The priestesses were not merely decorative figures. They held knowledge of traditions, ritual formulas, and myth that few had access to. They guarded sacred secrets and knew how to maintain divine favor over the polis. Imagine the responsibility. Any mistake could be interpreted as a negative omen, capable of compromising an entire harvest or even the city's security. It wasn't a symbolic role, but a vital one. This prestige was also reflected in everyday life. A respected priestess could indirectly influence community decisions, as men consulted her advice before acting on certain occasions. We can think of her as a spiritual advisor, someone whose opinion carried weight. even in a society that excluded women from formal politics. It was a subtle but profoundly effective power. There are clear parallels with contemporary figures. Consider spiritual or religious leaders who, even without political office, can influence crowds, guide movements, and inspire change. The Greek priestess was, in essence, a predecessor of this model. Her temple was the pulpit, and her rituals the language that connected humans and deity. And there was something even more significant. While many women were invisible outside the home, priestesses were remembered, named, even recorded in inscriptions. Their names endured through the centuries because they were associated with the sacred. This shows how, even amid so many limitations, there were paths narrow but real to female recognition. This space conquered within religion contrasts directly with the private lives of most women who spent most of their time confined to the gynecium, far from the gaze of the polis. And it is precisely there that we delve into the next point, the essentially private life, focused on the interior of the home. In ancient Greece, women's daily lives were almost entirely confined to their own homes. Public spaces, with their squares, assemblies, and markets, were male territory. For women, the home was both refuge and prison. There, surrounded by domestic chores and constant supervision, they spent most of their lives. Imagine waking up every day knowing that your world ends at your doorstep, a reality imposed, not chosen. This isolation was no accident, but part of a structure designed to preserve social order. The home was considered the proper place for women, and any deviation from this rule could generate distrust. Women walking alone on the streets? It was almost inconceivable. Today, it may seem absurd, but just compare it to the freedom to take a bus or go to the grocery store, trivial acts for us, but unattainable luxuries for them. The gynecium, a space reserved for women within the home, symbolized this confinement. It was there that they spent their time spinning, caring for their children, and supervising servants. The sound of the loom, the smells of the kitchen, and the voices of children were the soundtrack to their existence. And while there was life in this daily routine, there was also the weight of a routine that rarely allowed for change. This division between public and private spheres was also reflected in status. Men were recognized by the polis for their performance in war or politics, women for their work at home. It was as if they lived in parallel, complementary dimensions, but unequal in importance. Imagine a company where half the team works silently behind the scenes, never visible, yet bears the brunt of everything and never receives credit for it. And yet, this private life had its subtleties. At home, even confined, women exercised a form of authority, deciding routines, organizing work, and shaping their children. It was an invisible but essential power. The paradox lay precisely there. The more limited she was in the public sphere, the more indispensable she became in the private sphere. This contrast between being invisible outside the home and indispensable within it paves the way for us to better understand why the polis, this collective space, simply didn't recognize them as citizens. And it is at this point that we come to the issue of female political exclusion, one of the pillars of Greek society. In ancient Greece, the concept of citizenship was very specific. A citizen was a free man, born of the city, with the right to voice and participate. Women, despite being a fundamental part of society, were simply not recognized within this framework. They didn't vote, speak, or have a say in polis decisions. It was as if they lived on the fringes of an exclusive club, whose rules never allowed them to join. This separation was not only formal, but symbolic. The public square, the agora, was the center of civic life, and women were rarely seen there. The space that defined the city's destiny was off limits to the female gaze. Imagine living in a society where the major decisions that impact your life are made before your eyes, but without you being able to utter a single word. That's how it worked. This exclusion reflected a deep-seated belief that men's nature was political, while women's was domestic. Renowned philosophers reinforced this idea, legitimizing an inequality that had become almost naturalized. It's curious, because we still hear echoes of this today, when certain voices try to define what is a man's place and what is a woman's place. The centuries have changed, but certain mentalities still persist. Despite this, women saw the effects of political decisions up close. When the polis went to war, they were the ones who saw their husbands leave and often never return. When taxes rose, they were the ones who had to make ends meet at home. It's like today, decisions made in political offices impact the price of groceries or the lives of those struggling to balance household bills. They didn't participate, but they directly suffered the consequence, and this contrast only reinforces the injustice of the system. The polis celebrated the freedom of its citizens, but limited this concept to a small group, free men born in the city. Slaves, foreigners, and women were left out. A huge paradox for a society that took such pride in inaugurating democracy. After all, what kind of democracy is this that excludes half the population? This chasm between politics and domestic life leads us to take a closer look at a symbolic detail of female confinement, the gynaeceum, a reserved and segregated space within the home itself, where most of their lives took place. In ancient Greek politics, the assembly was the central stage of democracy. There, free men raised their voices, discussed, voted, and shaped the city's destiny. Women, they weren't even allowed. Their silence wasn't a matter of choice, but of imposition. It was as if they didn't exist as citizens. Public speaking, considered the pinnacle of political life, was an exclusively male privilege. This absence created a double barrier. Not only did women not have a vote, but they couldn't even voice their opinions in the debates that shaped laws. Imagine watching from afar as a group decides about your life, your family, the war that would take your children, and having no say. It's like being a spectator to your own existence, without ever being able to influence the script. The curious thing is that, in private life, a woman's voice carried weight. She gave orders to servants, guided her children, and decided household routine. But when she crossed the threshold, her voice was silenced. This contrast is like living in two distinct worlds: inside the home, authority; outside, invisibility. How often does this resonate today, when female voices are heard only in some contexts, but disregarded in others? Exclusion from public space also had symbolic implications. Rhetoric, the art of speaking effectively, was the citizen's quintessential instrument. Not allowing women to learn and use this tool kept them away from power. It was as if political language itself had an invisible fence. Male adultery, on the other hand, was seen almost as part of nature. A husband could visit prostitutes or have affairs on the side without major consequences. The cultural justification was that, for a man, such relationships did not threaten the legitimacy of his heirs. This logic reveals a glaring inequality. While women were punished for any misdeed, men were virtually exempt from criticism. This double standard echoes in many societies to this day. Just think about how, even today, women are judged more harshly for their emotional choices, while men are often labeled as virile for the same attitudes. Times change, but certain remnants remain. It's a reminder of how social norms profoundly shape behavior. And if we look at daily life at the time, we see how this rigidity shaped relationships within the home. The wife constantly watched, learned from an early age to maintain discretion, modesty, and obedience. The husband, on the other hand, moved freely around the polis and at banquet. This difference created parallel worlds, where inequality was not only practical but also symbolic. And it was precisely in this breach of morality that another category of women emerged: Kursens, known as heteteres. Unlike wives, they circulated in public spaces and had a peculiar social role. While legitimate wives lived confined to the gynaeceum, heteterae moved through other settings: symposia, parties, and banquets attended by the men of the polis. These women, although not citizens, enjoyed a rare freedom. They could move around, converse, discuss philosophy, and even influence their powerful clients. It was like living outside the rules, but paradoxically, with more movement and voice than wives confined to their home. Heteteres differed from ordinary prostitutes because they offered more than physical pleasure. Many were educated, mastered the art of conversation, and became intellectual companions to philosophers, politicians, and artists. It was almost like playing the role of advisor and muse at the same time. Consider a society that denied women formal education. The mere fact that some courtesans were cultured already made them exceptional figures. But this freedom had clear limits. Although respected in certain circles, heteteres never achieved the social status of legitimate wives. They could not marry Athenian citizens, nor could they guarantee the same rights for their children. It was a double life. On the one hand, recognition and influence in male circles; on the other, formal exclusion from the polis structures. It was like being invited to every event but never having your name registered on the official list. This ambiguity generated both fascination and contempt. Some saw them as free and intelligent women, capable of seducing with their minds and beauty. Others treated them with suspicion, as a threat to the traditional order. This tension demonstrates how contradictory Greek society was. It extolled the company of heteterai in public, but denied them space within the circle of family honor. And it's impossible not to think of the contrast between these women and the confined wives. While some lived surrounded by conversation and debate, others spent their days at the loom without access to the same social life. It was as if women's destiny was always limited, only in different forms: either the respectable silence of the wife or the restricted freedom of the courtesan. And, in this peculiar space they occupied, heteteres even attended symposia, banquets that were forbidden to legitimate wives. This is where we encounter a new important point: the presence of these women in intellectual and festive environments, where ideas and influences circulated. Symposia were one of the most significant social institutions in ancient Greece. There, men gathered to drink wine, converse, listen to music, and discuss philosophy. It was at these gatherings that ideas about politics, art, and ethics circulated freely. But there was a clear rule: legitimate wives could not be present. The space was exclusive to men, and in some cases to heteteres, who became the only female representatives in these vibrant environments. This presence completely changed the tone of the gathering. While wives were kept away, silent within the home, courtesans occupied the public space of pleasure and reflection. Many of them, educated and perceptive, actively participated in the conversations, exchanging arguments with philosophers and poets. It's almost ironic to think that, in a society that denied women formal education, some of them excelled precisely in intellectual arenas. The symposia were also places for cultural exhibitions. Music was played, poems were recited, theories were discussed, and the heirs were there, not just for entertainment, but as part of the dialogue. This placed them on an ambiguous social level. They were not citizens, but they had access to the most sophisticated aspects of Greek cultural life. It's like being in the audience and at the same time on stage in a grand play. This freedom, however, did not come without a price. Despite circulating in these environments, heirs had neither political rights nor family stability. They lived off their influence, intelligence, and charm, but with no guarantees for the future. Even so, it was a space for expression that contrasted sharply with the confinement of wives. Consider the paradox. The respectable woman was silenced, while the marginalized woman could speak. The presence of these women at the symposia demonstrates how Greek society functioned in layers. Intellectual prestige and public voice were within the reach of a few, and only precariously. But for those who did, it was an opportunity to leave their mark, and some heirs, like Aspasia of Miletus, truly did. Their names echoed alongside those of great leaders, demonstrating that even amid exclusion, there were opportunities for female influence. And while these women circulated at banquets and debates, the vast majority of wives continued to fulfill their destiny to bear children. After all, motherhood was considered not only a personal duty, but also a woman's primary social function. In ancient Greece, motherhood was not just an intimate desire, but almost a law of nature imposed by society. From marriage onward, women were expected to bear children, preferably sons, to continue their families and strengthen the pole. It was as if their entire identity were tied to this mission. Without children, their position in the home and within their social group was weakened, as if they had failed to fulfill their destined destiny. Motherhood, however, went far beyond bringing children into the world. It was considered a test of honor, both for the woman and her family. A wife who didn't get pregnant was viewed with suspicion. One who had several children gained respect and prestige. It's curious to think how the value of an entire life could be measured by the number of births. Today, when motherhood is or should be a choice, we realize the immense weight these women carried. Mothers' daily lives were filled with responsibilities. There were no daycare centers, schools, or health systems. Basic education, daily care, and even traditional medicine were left to them. From preparing baby food to treating fevers with herbs, everything depended on the practical wisdom of women. It was as if they were doctors, nutritionists, and teachers all at once, without any formal recognition. And there was also the symbolic dimension. Motherhood was compared to the cycle of the earth. The woman was the fertile soil, and the children, the harvested fruits. This metaphor, present in cults and rituals, reinforced the idea that procreation was a divine duty, not just a human one. It was beautiful in speech, but in practice it became a prison. Denying this role was nearly impossible. Women became confused with their ability to generate. Most impressively, despite the burden, there was also a side of silent resistance. In lullabies, in bedtime stories, in the small lessons imparted in daily life, mothers left profound marks on their children's development. Perhaps it was there, in this intimate space, that they truly exerted their influence, planting values and memories that would span generations. But it's important to remember, this role of giving birth carried enormous risks, and it's precisely in the next point that we see the cruelest side of this social requirement, the often dangerous and deadly childbirth that was part of so many women's routine. In ancient Greece, the birth of a child was shrouded in tension,
and uncertainty. With no specialized doctors, no hospitals, and no anesthesia, childbirth was a painful and risky process. Experienced midwives helped, but they couldn't always prevent the worst. Many women died very young, leaving small children and families destitute. The sound of a baby's first cry was always accompanied by anxiety. Would the mother survive? The risks were enormous. Infections, hemorrhages, and complicated birth were beyond the capabilities of the techniques of the time. Without antibiotics or adequate instruments, each birth was practically a roulette wheel of life. Today, when a woman enters a modern maternity ward, it's hard to imagine the significance of this technological advance. Simply access to a C-section or antibiotics would have saved countless lives in ancient Greece. This scenario created an immense emotional burden. Each pregnancy was both a blessing and a threat. The entire family prepared not only for the arrival of a new member, but also for the possibility of losing the mother. It was as if, with each pregnancy, the woman's life was put on hold, awaiting fate's verdict. It was a cycle of hope and fear that silently repeated itself within every home. Young maternal death was so common that it even shaped family structure. Widowers with young children had to remarry, and new wives often took on the care of children who weren't their own. This created complex households, rife with relationships between half-siblings and stepmothers, something we see reflected even in Greek tragedies, where dysfunctional families become the scene of intense conflict. And yet, childbirth wasn't seen simply as a risk, but as a rite of passage. The woman who survived earned respect, as if she had won a battle. She was recognized as a mother in the fullest sense of the word. This view reinforced the idea that motherhood was a test of courage and sacrifice, almost like an offering to the pole. This symbolic burden of birth also appears in literature and theater, where female figures are constantly portrayed in roles of suffering and sacrifice. And this is precisely where we enter the next point: how myths and tragedies represented women and their tensions with society. In Greek myths and tragedies, women take on intense roles, often greater than the daily life imposed on them. Clytemnestra, for example, is remembered as the wife who killed her husband Agamemnon upon his return from the Trojan War, an act of revenge, but also of affirmation. Antigone defied Creon's orders to bury her brother, representing the struggle between the law of the polis and the law of the family. And Medea, in her rage, goes so far as to kill her own children to harm her husband. These figures are not mere characters, they reflect the social tensions of the time. While real life confined women to silence, theater gave them a powerful, almost frightening voice. It's as if the stage was an escape valve, where the Greeks acted out repressed fears and desires. What could not be expressed in everyday life appeared symbolically in dramatic verse. The female presence in myths also reveals how men viewed women: dangerous, unpredictable, but also indispensable. Clytemnestra embodies the threat of the unfaithful wife. Medea symbolizes the fury of the rejected foreigner. Antigone, the courage of the young woman who defies order. Each of them shows how, behind the walls of the gyneceum, there was a latent power that society preferred to control, but never completely ignore. These stories have spanned centuries precisely because they speak to universal issues. Who hasn't witnessed a conflict between social laws and personal values, like Antigone?
Or heard of relationships derived by betrayal, as in the myth of Clytemnestra? Greek theater, though ancient, touches on human wounds that remain relevant to. In these plots, women aren't supporting characters, they are the driving force behind the tragedy. And it's interesting to note that by giving such prominence to female characters, Greek playwrights unintentionally revealed the symbolic power of women in their society. Although silenced in real life, they cried out on stage, reminding everyone that femininity could not be contained within the home. This symbolic power, even confined to the imaginary, connected to the practical role of women in everyday life. They shaped the polis not through politics, but through the education and upbringing of their children. And it is precisely this point that we delve into next. In ancient Greece, even without a political voice, women exerted a subtle but decisive influence on the upbringing of their children. It was within the home that future citizens learned their first lessons of discipline, values, and respect. The mother, by teaching customs and stories, planted the seeds that would shape the adult man's character. Thus, even though the polis formally excluded them, their destiny was, in part, woven by female hands. This role was clear from childhood. The boy who would later become a warrior, politician, or philosopher first learned from his mother how to control impulses, respect traditions, and handle the small responsibilities of the home. It's as if she were his first school, invisible but indispensable. Think about how often, even today, a person's values reflect the maternal teachings received in everyday life. The influence wasn't limited to behavior. Many mothers told myths, narrated heroic deeds, or taught songs that extolled honor and courage. These were emotional lessons, not rational ones, but ones that remained etched in children's memories. It's like when we remember the stories of grandparents or parents who shaped our worldview. It didn't matter whether they were scientific or not, but rather the impact they had on our hearts. And even daughters, though destined to the same confinement as their mothers, received from this education the tools to maintain the tradition. Mothers taught women how to weave, cook, and take care of the home, perpetuating this. Thus, from generation to generation, women passed on not only practices but also a mindset. The home thus became a kind of silent school, whose diploma came not on paper but in behavior. It's curious to note that this maternal influence was often ignored by the men of the polis. They celebrated the role of the active citizen, but forgot that this citizen only existed because he was raised by a dedicated mother. It's as if the foundation of a building were invisible, but without it, the building simply wouldn't stand. And this educational function of women was also connected to another essential aspect: domestic rituals, family religion, and the role of guardians of the cultural traditions that kept the polis cohesive. In the Greek home, women didn't just cook or care for the children, they also kept the family's spiritual traditions alive. It was their responsibility to keep the hearth fire burning, make small offerings to the household gods, and conduct rituals that ensured protection for the home. These seemingly simple gestures carried enormous cultural weight as they connected the family to the deities. It was as if the flame in the hearth was the spiritual heart of the okas. Motherhood, in turn, was laden with religious symbolism. Giving birth was seen as a divine act, and each child born was celebrated in small rites. The mother in this process was not only a caregiver, but also an intermediary between the human and the sacred. Imagine the impact of this every daily gesture: breastfeeding, teaching a song, telling a myth, was inserted into a larger dimension of preserving the cosmic order. These practices strengthened family cohesion. A meal, for example, was not just food, but also a ritual moment. Before eating, small offerings might be made. At the end of the day, a prayer would be recited before the fire. These habits, repeated daily, created continuity between generations. It's like how today families maintain Christmas or Easter traditions, passing on values without the need for long words. Women, therefore, were the guardians of memory. There were no books for everyone, nor schools accessible to girls, but there were stories told, myths preserved,
songs passed down in the silence of the gynoecium. This orality was powerful, for it kept the link between past and present alive. If men wrote laws and treaties, women engraved the cultural identity of the polis in the memory of their children. It's curious to see how this role, though invisible, sustained the very continuity of society. Without women to maintain domestic rights, public religion would have lost part of its foundation. It's as if the city's great temple depended on the small altar in each home. This intimate connection between everyday life and the divine shows that, even confined, women were indispensable. But not everyone viewed this role with due value. Philosophers and thinkers of the time often described women as naturally inferior, reinforcing the view that their function was merely biological or domestic. And it is precisely this contrast that we will explore below. In the writings of many Greek philosophers, the view of women was marked by prejudice. Aristotle, for example, asserted that women were incomplete men, incapable of fully exercising reason. This idea, rooted in the thinking of the time, justified their exclusion from politics, education, and public life. It was as if philosophy, which so ardently sought universal truth, suffered from a profound social blind spot. This discourse shaped behaviors and beliefs. If great thinkers defended female inferiority, society legitimized their exclusion. Imagine being repeatedly told that you don't think as you should, that your nature is limited, that your role is limited to the home. These weren't just words, they were invisible walls built with the authority of philosophy. But there were exceptions. Plato, in his work The Republic, even argued that women could, in theory, be guardians and even rulers, as long as they received the same education as men. A revolutionary idea for the time, but one that remained more utopian than practical. Still, his proposal shows that not everyone blindly accepted the consensus of inferiority. This contrast invites us to consider how many brilliant ideas were stifled because women were denied the space to express them. If philosophy is the exercise of thought, how many philosophies could have emerged from silenced female minds? It's as if an entire library had been left closed, never read. And this philosophical legacy wasn't limited to the past. For centuries, the view of women's inferiority continued to resonate, justifying their exclusion in different cultures. Today, it's often necessary to combat prejudices that stem from these ancient ideas. It's impressive how words written over 2,000 years ago can still influence modern minds. And when we remember that our primary sources on Greece were written by men, we realize a final layer to this problem. The memory of Greek women comes to us filtered, always through the male gaze. It is this delicate point that concludes our journey. Almost everything we know about women in ancient Greece comes from texts written by men, philosophers, poets, legislators. This means that their memory was always recorded through an external perspective, often fraught with prejudice or reductionist views. It's like trying to know a person solely through the descriptions of neighbors who never heard them speak for themselves. Their voices were absent from the pages that have survived. This absence creates a huge gap. When we read about women's roles, we see descriptions of duties, restrictions, and functions, but we rarely gain access to what they thought or felt about them. The silence imposed on everyday life ended up echoing throughout history. The impression is that they existed only as shadows, but we know better. They shaped the polis with their hands, their motherhood, their rights, and their constant presence in the home. Some exceptions, such as the Hetera Aspasia, companion of Pericles, or accounts of priestesses, offer us different insights, but they are fragments, points of light amidst a vast darkness. Most Greek women lived and died without ever leaving a record of their thoughts about their fate. It's as if the book of history had pages torn out, impossible to fully recover. This male filter also distorted perceptions. When we read tragedies or treatises, we see women portrayed as dangerous, fragile, or submissive. But to what extent did this reflect reality, or was it simply a projection of male anxieties about female power? Questions like these remain open because there is a lack of direct sources that tell us the other side of the narrative. Yet, even from incomplete records, we can discern the silent importance of these women. They didn't speak publicly, but their presence shaped families, customs, traditions, and even myths. Historical silence doesn't erase their true relevance. On the contrary, it encourages us to search between the lines for the traces of their existence. And perhaps this is the great challenge: learning from the past that it's not enough to record history. We must give a voice to all who lived it, for memory cannot depend solely on those who write, but also on those who feel. And it is at this point that we conclude the cycle of topics, ready to take the next step. After learning about the journey of women in ancient Greece, it's impossible not to wonder, what direction would our history have taken if they had been heard? How many ideas, how many philosophies, how many different paths might have emerged if they had had a voice? This silence imposed long ago echoes to this day, and the question remains, how long will we repeat patterns that should have been left in the past? Now it's your turn. Looking at your life, in what areas have you been silent about your own voice? What space could you occupy but haven't yet? Reflect on this and tell me in the comments, because your experience may inspire others who are also here. Of course, if this content made you think, touched you, or opened your eyes to something new, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue learning and growing with me with each new video. After all, this is just one of many stories we'll explore together.